The Velvet Revolution. For Czechoslovakia, the Velvet Revolution, which occurred in 1989, was a crucial time in the history of the country. It was an important time that changed the communist regime. After the fall of the Berlin Wall, Czechoslovakia abolished its communist regime and sparked a new hope for democracy and basic freedoms. Some historical context. For decades, it was a communist party that had rules over Czechoslovakia, and they had represented and posed a lot of limitations and infringements on the basic rights and freedoms of the citizens. The Prague Spring in 1968 proved to be significant as it was the fourth time that the Soviet Union had intervened, and because it was the fourth time, it was just people like the citizens of the country were crushed by the desire for change. They had little hope at this point. However, this also acted as a trigger for citizens' frustrations and the narrowness of Gustav Husak's rule. Gustav Husak, he was a political member of the communist rule. So within his regime, as his regime continued, this led the people to build discontent with the change back to the authoritarian rule. So the breaking point, the whole conflict in former Czechoslovakia between dissidents, these are people who have opposing views to the government, and the communist regime began with a series of turning point events which sparked protests and resilience. The abolishment of the Prague Spring in 1968, dubbed Socialism with a Human Face by the USSR, was a defining moment. So what the Prague Spring was, it was basically the USSR had appointed Alexander Dubček as the new leader of Czechoslovakia, and he had more liberal views than former presidents and leaders. And so he had implemented governmental and economic reforms that allowed or increased more freedoms for the citizens. However, the Soviet Union did not like this at all, so they replaced him with Gustav Husak. So the Soviet invasion aimed at nothing else but to kill the dream of the change, in which in turn saw Czechoslovakia return to Husak's totalitarian governance. This fall from liberalism caused public discontent and a rise in dissent. After the Soviet invasion, the citizens of Czechoslovakia became restless and wanted to openly voice their demands and opinions after being silenced for decades due to the oppressive rule for 21 years. Those who worked with and helped the Soviets became known as traitors to the society of Czechoslovakia. Another major event that led to the Velvet Revolution was the sacrifice of Jan Palach. In January of 1969, a student named Jan Palach had decided to sacrifice himself in order to express the protest against Czechoslovakian invasion. Palach tried his luck by climbing up the stairs of a national museum at a corner of Wenceslas Square near a live train station. He poured gasoline on himself and lit himself up with a matchstick. Um, he had survived, however, when he was hospitalized and he was being interviewed, he said that he wanted to follow his inner voice and held the Soviet occupation responsible for the alienation of the people from their country. He sadly did end up dying 3 days later after being hospitalized. So who was impacted directly? Political dissidents, activists, and regular citizens who had to bear the burden of the oppressive constructed communist government that prevented so many rights. They were persecuted and branded as traitors, and the liberation was really rare for them. These were people who were, in one way or another, censored, lied to, and oppressed by propaganda, state repressions, and media misconceptions that aimed to silence others and maintain existing authoritarian systems. So, who was impacted indirectly? In addition, the entire Czech society and future generations of people were also seriously influenced by the limitations on their freedom that embodied the communist regime. Besides, the directly targeted activities against dissidents greatly influenced the complexities of the restrictions, which contributed to the development of a culture of fear and distrust. On November 17, 1989, 20 years later, the streets of Prague filled with students from Prague University and so many others to help protest the leadership. The police were heavily deployed to suppress the protests, thinking that they could put an end to the pressure for change. However, it seemed that many people had enough of the communist regime and communist authority and were willing to stand up against and fight against the oppressive regime. Just 3 days later, over 500,000 citizens crowded the streets to protest and fight back in a non-violent way. The Communist Party was forced out, and for the first time since 1948, Czechoslovakia was about to have an elected president. So, in the eyes of the government, the Velvet Revolution showed the need to remain in power for them. The communist government viewed the uprising as an immediate threat coming from within, coming for their power positions, stability, and hence they resorted to oppressive methods with everything on their way to retain the status quo. The government of that time, at a certain point, regarded the revolutionary movement as a rival, as I've just said, and as an agent that disturbed the existing systems already placed in the country to cause a power shift. Therefore, they initiated a campaign to oppress and dispossess the opponents. The citizens' perspective of the state of the country was a combination of anger due to the lack of freedoms, but also a sense of optimism, which is for a hope for a better future. There was an emergence of ordinary citizens who were fed up and tired of years of communist governance, denying them their rights to participate in any democratic events, but also denying them basic rights such as freedom of speech. Many have felt as though that the communists as a whole have been against them and pushed them and created a depressing climate in the country. Apart from the hardships that they faced, there was also an emerged ray of hope and optimism, as I've just said. So, one of the barriers is stereotype and labels. So, people who opposed, criticized, or did not support the communist political system were considered enemies of the state and were depicted as traitors. Propaganda drew these critics and activists as dangerous men who looked to destabilize all the things that they thought were important, attacking everything that seemed patriotic. The second barrier is systemic barriers. So, the first obviously being with just a communist party. Having a communist party rule over a country means there's really no democracy. The oppression of the civil society included also banning of independent organizations, labor unions, and parties that opposed the power of the communist government. Most elementary rights, such as freedom of speech, assembly, and associating with others, along with many more, were also met with punishment such as arrest and imprisonment. The third barrier is misrepresentations in media. So, government-controlled media portray the opposing voices as marginal, downplaying the significance of the protests or the movements advocating for change. Dissidents were usually portrayed as extremists or enemies, and they were described as problem makers, or they were just ignored altogether. Public opinion was also tarnished through selective reporting and censorship, which reinforced an untrue narrative with the supposed regime legitimacy and the opposition movement's silence. Some of the immediate repercussions include it marked the end of the Velvet Revolution and the Soviet influence on Czechoslovakia. After the collapse of communism, power was renounced from the Communist Party, paving the way for a democratic reform and the election of Václav Havel as president. The new government had its goals of a democratic country aiming for freedom and a free market economy. In 1992, Czechoslovakia peacefully split into two different countries, as there were differences between the two groups on how they wanted to govern the country. So in Czechoslovakia, there was the Czechs and the Slavics, and they were two completely distinct and different cultures, and they had made different national identities for themselves. So this is what made them split apart. And then soon after, the Czech Republic and Slovakia also became a part of the European Union. Despite the significant progress achieved since the Velvet Revolution, both countries are still grappling with issues like corruption, regional inequalities, and political divisions. Concluding remarks, the Velvet Revolution remains a crucial turning point in the history of Czechoslovakia, serving as a timeless reminder of the ability of citizens to bring about extraordinary change. Its impact continues to influence the path of Czech and Slavic societies, advocating for movements for democracy and um, social equality worldwide. While the initial aftermath brought a sense of optimism and democratic transformation, the ongoing challenges faced by present-day Czech and Slavic people still highlight the importance of safeguarding the freedoms that were hard-won in the past. As we honor the legacy of the Velvet Revolution, it serves as a powerful reminder of the enduring value of freedom and democracy.